It's Cougar Sports Saturday.
That's caught! Touchdown! Stayed inside the boundary and gets in for 6.
Cougar Sports Saturday, a presentation of KSL Sports.
Richie right to the rim, driving score! He would not be denied!
BYU Sports Talk by Cougar fans for Cougar fans. Sponsored by Any Hour Services, Electrical, Plumbing, Heating, and Air. Your hosts are Mitch Harper and Kyle Ireland. On Utah's legacy home of the Cougars, KSL News Radio, 102.7 FM and 1160 AM.
Good afternoon, Cougar Nation. Welcome on into Cougar Sports Saturday here on a BYU basketball game day as BYU gets ready to take on the Utah Utes. Mitch Harper here with you on KSL News Radio. We'll be live here between 12 to 2:30, getting you ready for tip between the Cougs and the Utes. Then we'll toss it over to Greg Wrubell and Mark Durant for the call between this heated rivalry game between BYU and Utah. BYU winners of 7 of the last 10 in this rivalry game. Tip-off today at 3:30. Pre-game will get rolling with Greg and Mark at 2:30. But it's a big game for BYU, and I really think it's the beginning of a big stretch of games for BYU basketball over the next 6 games. You look at today, BYU's a heavy favorite over the Utes. Utah's lost 12 consecutive road games, 10 in Big 12 play, so they're not good on the road. And I think BYU, after only winning by 5 points 2 weeks ago at the Huntsman Center, they're going to be looking to make a statement, especially on the heels of a disappointing performance last week against Texas Tech. But this stretch of games coming up with Utah today, Monday night against number 1 Arizona, and then next Saturday against the Kansas Jayhawks, which earlier today was announced that ESPN's College Game Day will be in attendance for BYU and Kansas at historic Allen Fieldhouse. We'll be there at that game as well. We'll have pregame next week at noon for the Cougs and the Jayhawks. Tip-off for that one officially got announced for 2:30 p.m. But if BYU is currently projected as a 3 seed in bracketology, this next stretch of games can really catapult BYU, but you got to take care of business first against the rival, because all the feel-goods of what this season has been, and BYU's been outstanding this year, 16-2. Even after that loss to Texas Tech, I still look at this BYU team as one of the best in college basketball this year, and a team that could get to the Final Four. I mean, this team is elite at the top end of the roster. But you got to take care of business against the rival, and then, of course, things really ramp up in terms of seed line opportunities, really elevating that resume and putting it in position to maybe get in the conversation for a 2 seed or maybe a puncher's chance of a 1 seed. There's an outside chance of that. But it's a huge day, and it gets rolling today after that midweek break for BYU basketball. You can interact with me on X at Mitch_Harper, or you can text us 57500. Tito, board op, helping out produce today. Appreciate Tito for helping me out today, rolling solo as we get ready on this rivalry game day for BYU and Utah. But BYU basketball head coach Kevin Young, he's 2-1 in these rivalry games against the Utes. Last year, lost at the Huntsman Center, but then got a dominant win in the Marriott Center. Then, of course, 2 weeks ago, got that 5-point victory over Utah in Salt Lake City. But after a week off since that loss to Texas Tech, where BYU was up by 9 points, and then they gave up a 30-10 run to the Red Raiders, this is how Kevin Young described how this week's of practice have been coming off a loss.
Henry, led by me. I think some of the guys as well, and that's kind of what you want. I thought today was great. A couple of days was a little bit more of a grind out, but it's a long season, and I think getting through a season mentally just as much as physically is a challenge in every year, because there's so much that goes into it. So I thought our guys found a way to help themselves get better and be focused, but still kind of be ticked off that we didn't get a win on the road.
I like that word by Kevin Young, Henry, for this BYU team, and it's good to hear that, because this BYU team this year has really not faced much adversity. Yeah, they've had personnel that have been out for the season due to injuries, like a Dawson Baker, a Nate Pickens, things like that really, when you get to this point of the season, are much bigger losses than I think in the moment we realized when those injuries occurred. But from a losses standpoint, this team has not really faced any adversity. And I look at that Texas Tech game last week, and I don't look at that as a sound the alarm moment for this team. I think that honestly it was a impressive performance to the point where BYU got up 9. They just couldn't finish the job. And I thought that was a learning opportunity for Kevin Young and his staff to really figure out how they're going to run down games and close it out on the road. Today is not going to be the example, ideally, where BYU's in a tricky spot. If they're, expected to do what they're supposed to do, they should comfortably cruise against Utah. But in other spots, when the schedule really ramps up, as soon as 48 hours from now when they take on Arizona and then next week against Kansas, closing out games will be key for BYU. But this whole week to have off and really identify what the issues were in that setback in Lubbock, I think that was really good for BYU. A.J. DeBonsa, star freshman for the Cougars, he had a season-low 13 points in the setback in Lubbock against Texas Tech. And what was surprising about that game was A.J. only had one free throw attempt. You think about how much contact A.J. draws game after game, and for him to only get one free throw attempt, I was kind of blown away by that last week. Not going to say, Big 12 refs were the cause of BYU's fall. I mean, BYU just didn't get it done last week. But A.J., he was on the coach's show this week with head coach Kevin Young, and he described what lessons were learned from last week's setback in West Texas.
We learned a lot. We watched the film after the game. We seen exactly what we did wrong offensively and defensively. It was still a winnable game despite how bad we played, but we're going to bounce back. Good thing that we have them again. It's going to be a good rematch.
One of the things that, was becoming a little bit of a trend for this BYU team as of late, they're struggling to hit the three. BYU's at 23% or lower over the last 3 games in Big 12 play. And look, this team is constructed a lot differently than maybe the last 2 Big 12 BYU teams where there was a heavy reliance on knocking down the 3-point shot. But I still believe that when this team hits it at a high clip, they're going to be nearly unbeatable with the talent that they have at the top of the roster. If they can hit their threes consistently, that's going to be a tough out for anyone that they face this season. So that's going to be something you want to see maybe get corrected this week. But I'm curious to see how A.J. responds after, by his standards, what would be a little bit of a letdown performance, only 13 points a week ago. But the amount of attention that A.J. commands has been just really impressive. I mean, you think about last week, Texas Tech, that was the main focal point of their efforts, was to slow down A.J., not get him to the free throw line. So much attention spent. And it worked out for him. We'll see if Utah, who 2 weeks ago, they were double and triple teaming A.J. more than I've really ever seen against one guy in a January conference game. Sometimes you'll see that in tournament play, but in a conference game, you rarely see that level of attention given. I'll be curious to see if Utah does that again today and tries to almost say, let Rob Wright and Richie Saunders beat you, which that's not a recipe for success either with BYU's Big 3. But BYU and Utah coming up today, 3:30 tip-off right here on KSL. We'll have coverage inside the Marriott Center on KSLSports.com. We'll have post-game reaction as well on the Cougar Tracks podcast for you as well, with BYU getting ready for a rivalry game against a Utah team that earlier this week they had a tough setback against Kansas State in Manhattan. They were right there against K-State. And I'll say about Utah, I think they've gotten better since their performance against BYU. I think that was kind of a turning point game for Utah. They've been struggling on the road, but they got a big win last Saturday against TCU. They were really competitive against K-State in Manhattan. So I don't think BYU can take this Utah team lightly, and I do think that the loss last week to Texas Tech has BYU really dialed in and focused for this game coming up today against the Utes, because you got to take care of rivalry games. You want to continue to stack up those wins in the rivalry. You can't ever give any sort of edge in the rivalry. This is game number 2 between Kevin Young and Alex Jensen. I would like to think that this is probably going to be the 2 head coaches for a very long time for these 2 programs, going back and forth in the Big 12. Should be some really good battles between these 2 head coaches with strong NBA backgrounds in their coaching careers. Let's take our first break. On the other side, we'll get some more commentary from head coach Kevin Young and A.J. DeBonsa as we get you ready for BYU and Utah here on KSL News Radio. Taking the break, more Cougar Sports Saturday after this right here on KSL News Radio. Welcome back into Cougar Sports Saturday here on KSL News Radio. Mitch Harper here with you. We're live here in Provo getting ready for BYU and Utah. It's a BYU basketball game day, 16-2 BYU versus 9-10 Utah. Cougs won the last meeting against the Utes, 89-84. They'll look to try to maybe get a double-digit victory here. I think that's doable. BYU's almost a 20-point favorite in today's game against the Utes, and head coach Kevin Young is going to be looking for his third consecutive win over Utah dating back to last season. And when asked if they underestimated Utah in the first matchup 2 weeks ago, this was KY.
No, I don't think we underestimated them. Even I know the coaches didn't. I don't think the players did either. I think they knew, rivalry game on the road is going to be a tough game, and they played well. I mean, look, those two guards, man, they've been torching the entire Big 12. They're doing it to every team, and so I have a lot of respect for Coach Jensen and what they're trying to do there. And they played good. They played good, and we had to really gut it out. But I thought it was good for our guys to have to be in a hostile environment and come away and find a way to win.
And that they did. And it's interesting this game today because not many teams would ever think of this. But for BYU, it's a unique circumstance. They've got a game today, a big game, rivalry game. But then on Monday, they have a chance to face number 1 Arizona on Monday at 7 p.m. And, of course, with BYU, they don't practice on Sunday. So it's an interesting dynamic that BYU has after they get done with this game. It's a quick turnaround to the number 1 team in the country who's currently in action right now against West Virginia. And this was Kevin Young on if his team potentially is looking ahead to the Wildcats past Utah.
I mean, look, if we went up to Salt Lake and beat Utah by 30, maybe. If we weren't coming off of a loss, maybe. It's a chance to compete. I don't think anyone's it's a human element. I'm not going to act like it doesn't exist. But, look, Utah's a good team. They've played every team in our league for the most part very competitively. They got 2 of the best scorers in our league. And so everyone understands that what the task at hand is. And, I don't think there's going to be any type of, letdown or distraction given everything I just said.
And this was Kevin Young, too, on how his team's planning for Arizona without having a Sunday practice.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting and thought-provoking topic, Jay, that you bring up. Obviously, your experience covering BYU, I'm sure that's not the first time that it's happened. I'm sure it'd be an interesting thing to see how people over the years in all sports have tackled that. I'm pretty singular focused. We got a game against Utah tomorrow. We need to win that ball game. We've talked about different things that are above board that we could do on Sunday to just make sure that we don't just show up on Monday and play the game. And we've kind of gone through the necessary channels to make sure we're following what's in line there, and we'll attack it that way. Also, like I said, not losing sight of the task at hand, which is to beat Utah.
And that is the task in front of BYU today, to take down the rival Utes, who come into the game 9-10 on the season. For some interesting notes on BYU coming into this game, the Cougars entering this contest today, they're 4-1 in Big 12 play, 16-2 overall. Let's get to a break real quick, and then on the other side we'll get to more BYU basketball talk here on KSL News Radio.
It's Cougar Sports Saturday.
That's caught! Touchdown! Stayed inside the boundary and gets in for 6.
Cougar Sports Saturday, a presentation of KSL Sports.
Richie right to the rim, driving score! He would not be denied!
BYU Sports Talk by Cougar fans for Cougar fans. Sponsored by Any Hour Services, electrical, plumbing, heating, and air. Your hosts are Mitch Harper and Kyle Ireland. On Utah's legacy home of the Cougars, KSL News Radio, 102.7 FM and 1160 AM.
Welcome back into Cougar Sports Saturday here on KSL News Radio, your legacy home of the Cougars. Going to be joined here shortly by BYU basketball great and former NBA player Fred Roberts here shortly on this rivalry game day as we get ready for BYU and Utah. Tip-off today at 3:30 p.m. right here on KSL News Radio, the KSL News Radio app, KSLSports.com. So many different ways to listen to the show and today's game between BYU and Utah. If you miss any part of this program, you can subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcast. So it's BYU and Utah. It's interesting, the BYU-Utah rivalry in basketball, for whatever reason, doesn't seem to have as much intensity as it once did. Maybe just because of how high the stakes have become in football. But I think that the basketball side of this BYU-Utah rivalry has a ton of history. And to join me now, a man that was part of this BYU-Utah rivalry, a BYU basketball great, former NBA player, Fred Roberts, here on Cougar Sports Saturday. And Fred, thanks for taking the time to join me today. When you think of BYU-Utah on the hardwood, what comes to mind?
Oh, boy. I wish it were all good memories, but for sure. In fact, I was with Jeff Chapman last night, and we were talking about more against Utah, but most of what comes to mind with Utah is just what it played were great, and for sure when I played against Utah, they were great. I mean, he had hit going up against Frank. Man, it was just a battle, and we knew it would be or harassment, but it was.
We'll have to reconnect with Fred. I think his phone connection here was disconnecting a little bit. Maybe we'll re-effort getting Fred Roberts a line. Again, former BYU great Fred Roberts is joining us as we get ready for BYU and Utah tip-off today at 3:30. It was cool that, you think about the stretch when Fred Roberts was playing at BYU, from 78 to 82. Those were kind of the peak, I think, years of the BYU-Utah basketball rivalry. I think as time has shifted over time, I think America's just gotten so consumed by football that it's really kind of heightened the football. And, of course, BYU football won a national title in 84, and Utah started to have some more success when McBride came along, and then Whittingham. The new football era with Morgan Scalley and Kalani Sitake should be really fun. But basketball for BYU and Utah has had a ton of history. And joining us again is Fred Roberts. Fred, I think we disconnected there for a brief moment, but what do you make of seeing BYU and Utah back in a conference? Do you think that adds to the appeal of this rivalry once again now that they're back in the Big 12 in year two of this thing?
Yes, I absolutely do. I think that they're both of them. They're both good teams, great programs, and you get in the conference, and it definitely means more when you're fighting for a top spot in the conference, and when you're engaged with Utah in that situation. It absolutely intensifies the rivalry.
What's been your impressions of this year's BYU team with the star power at the top? And I mean, you were part of a team, one of the great BYU teams with star power with yourself and Danny Ainge in '81. But this team with A.J. DeBonsa and Richie Saunders and Rob Wright, what's your been impressions of this group a little past the midway point of the season?
I just think, through the summer, and I hadn't seen them, but through the summer, I've got friends and people who follow pretty closely and say, "Oh, these guys are so great, so great." Well, let's see. And then I saw them, and I said, "Yep, they're great. They are really something. They are fun, and they're just so athletic and talented. They are really exciting to watch."
What's been your thoughts on A.J. DeBonsa and his – does it kind of blow you away like many in Cougar Nation where possibly the number one draft pick's playing at BYU right now?
If I had a chance to take him, I'd take him. And even if that meant number one, I would take him. I think he's got incredible talent, and he's got a toughness about him. He's got a will to win that I've just noticed that he's going to be a great player. He's just one of those guys that everything's coming together. Plus, he's got that will. He's got the Michael Jordan will that he can make these things happen. Whether he'll have that kind of career or not, who knows? But, I think he's got all the tools.
That's a great point. The will, the desire. I think sometimes you look at, heralded, recruits and five-star prospects and wonder how are they going to fit in the locker room. And BYU's been so reliant at times on just the culture of the locker room, and I think he's enhanced that locker room. How important is that, you think, in AJ this season, but also in his future NBA career, that he's a guy that really uplifts everyone around him, it seems like?
Well, and I don't know him, but he seems like a likable guy. He seems like he wants to be a team guy. He wants to be involved in the community. But I just have seen him when they're in the struggle moments where he just gets this grit and look about him that I can just see him in an 82-game season and the playoffs where he is always going to be a force, and he will force his will on the game.
Talk with Fred Roberts, BYU basketball great and former NBA player, right here on Cougar Sports Saturday as we get ready for BYU and Utah later today. BYU basketball is, nationally ranked and got everything in front of them this season and being in the Big 12. How much are you enjoying as a former BYU alum to see the heights that Kevin Young and this program really has taken this year and really since – for decades now, this BYU basketball program has been growing for years, but to see where it's at right now, how rewarding is that as a BYU alum?
Well, I just think that as far as the program goes, I don't know, being an alumni, that's great, it's wonderful, but it's a whole nother level. It's completely different than what it's ever been. The players they're able to bring in, the excitement, the facility, the training, all of that is it's not even, it's dark ages compared to the brave new world. And these guys, with the athletes that they have, it's completely exciting. They're in a conference that when I was playing, if we'd have been in that conference, who knows, it's just, we would have competed for sure. We had the great players, but now with the training that these guys have and the level of competitiveness that all those teams have in that Big 12 conference is pretty amazing. And BYU, if they put it together, they're for sure one of the top 4 teams in the country. Well, I say for sure. I'm a guy that said Minnesota shouldn't have drafted Kevin Garnett. So I don't know, but they sure look like that kind of team that could go all the way.
Do you think this is the team to at least match or get further than your 81 team that got to the Elite Eight?
Oh yeah, I think this team really could play for the championship. And that's kind of the way. Maybe it's always been this way, but there are probably a top 6 to 8 teams that could peak at the right time, have luck be on their side, have health be on their side. They've got all the parts that can take them to a championship for sure. I have no question about that they could play for that championship.
What does it take to get to an Elite Eight? Like, what do you remember about your team's run that made that magical run possible and to make that happen?
That's a good question. We had a good year, and we played that year. Our conference was very strong, had great players in the conference, and we had a good year. And we kind of just had there was a spirit about the team and the unity and the talent. And then Ainge, I think we go into that the NC2As, and I think he was great anyway, but then when we went in the NC2As, he just said, I got I'm going to go play baseball, so who cares? I'm going to just let it fly. And he did. He just kind of took off, and we kind of got in behind him and had some just, we started out way back east, but it kind of didn't matter. It kind of maybe took some of the pressure off us those first couple of games playing back east, and we got a roll, and we won those first two games. And the third game we're playing against Notre Dame, and we really felt like we could win these games. We probably should have. I think we should have probably and could have beaten Virginia, but again, that's one of those things that any team could have risen to the top. But we had the spirit of the team, the players. We liked each other. We had good talent. We had size. And we kind of had fun.
He's Fred Roberts, BYU basketball legend, former NBA player. Fred, thanks for taking the time to join me today on this BYU-Utah game day, and hope to do this again down the road.
Thank you, and good luck, Cougars. Go get them.
That's Fred Roberts here on Cougar Sports Saturday. Let's take a break. On the other side, we'll get to some more BYU basketball talk to get ready on this game day. Maybe an early look at Arizona, too. Check in on the score as the Wildcats look to remain unbeaten and potentially set up a number one Arizona coming in on Monday to the Marriott Center. It's Cougar Sports Saturday. It's powered by KSL Sports. Welcome back into Cougar Sports Saturday here on KSL News Radio. Mitch Harper here with you. Getting ready for BYU and Utah. Tip-off today at 3:30 p.m. here on KSL. In 2 days, it's a quick turnaround. Enjoy whatever happens today with BYU and Utah, and then after, it's a quick turnaround to the Arizona Wildcats. Arizona right now is in action down in Tucson against West Virginia. The number one ranked Wildcats are 19-0 this season, looking to improve to 20-0. They are currently up on West Virginia 20-8 in the first half of play down at the McHale Center. 37-21, 2:32 to go in Tucson at the McHale Center for Arizona and West Virginia. So that game looks like it's in control for the Arizona Wildcats, which would mean most likely BYU on Monday night is going to see a 20-0 team, number one team in the country, rolling into Provo. That's big time. The last time a number one team came to Provo was when Gonzaga came to town. That was with Jalen Suggs, that Gonzaga team. So it's not often that you get the number one team ever facing BYU, let alone potentially, in the Marriott Center. And that's what's going to be the case on Monday night. So it'll be a quick turnaround from this Utah game today, and then a big Monday 7 p.m. tip against the Wildcats on Monday night. Again, they still got to take care of business. It's 2:28 to go in the first half, but they're in control on their home court at the McHale Center. And it brings back Big Monday to the Marriott Center on Monday night because remember the old days of the WAC and even the Mountain West when you get some 10 p.m. tip-offs with BYU and UNLV. There were some BYU-Utah Big Monday games back in the day, too. Bob Carpenter would be on the call from ESPN. Jimmy Dykes, he was the analyst. Those were some great times. Big Monday broadcast in the old WAC and Mountain West days. But Monday games are always tricky for BYU because of that no Sunday element with practice and things like that. But at the same time, if you think long-term, this weekend can be a little bit of a trial run of sorts because, of course, BYU wants to eventually, they want to navigate this season and get to potentially a Final Four. And what's the Final Four? That's a Saturday, Monday. So a little bit of a, trial run for BYU to get used to its workflow this weekend of taking care of business against Utah. You got to get that one done first. And then the quick turnaround to the number one ranked Wildcats on Monday, who are every bit as good as advertised. I mean, this might be the best Arizona team since probably 2001. That was the last time they reached the Final Four. This is a loaded Arizona team with a star freshman in their own right in Koa Pete. They've got so much talent. Jaden Burries, Del Orso, and they beat BYU in the Marriott Center last year, and they had one of the largest road contingents that I've ever seen in my time covering BYU basketball with a media credential roll into the Marriott Center before. Like, you were hearing loud U of A chants in that game last year, so that should be just an absolutely electric atmosphere on Monday night. But I think today's going to be awesome too. Whenever it's BYU and Utah, say less. I mean, that's just what it is when these two teams meet in anything, and then especially with basketball, so much on the line with the Big 12 stage. Other scores around the Big 12 conference right now: Texas Tech is up on Houston 52-43. 2 minutes to go in the first half in Lubbock for that one as Texas Tech host Houston. That game got moved up earlier today due to all the winter storms in the Midwest stretching out to the east. That was the College Game Day host today on ESPN. BYU and Kansas next week is going to host College Game Day on ESPN at Allen Fieldhouse. Tip-off for that game next week's at 2:30 p.m. on ESPN and right here on KSL. Speaking of Kansas, Darren Peterson, their star freshman, he's out with an ankle injury today. They're going to be taking on Kansas State in Manhattan. It's not expected to be a long-term injury for that ankle for Darren Peterson. So Kansas, they play today against K-State, and then they're off for a week until next Saturday against BYU. So you would assume that Darren Peterson will be well rested for that game between BYU and Kansas next Saturday, between possibly the top two picks in the NBA draft next June when A.J. DiBonsa and Darren Peterson square off. Other games around the Big 12 today: Iowa State and Oklahoma State are about to tip off. That one's going to be taking place in Stillwater. Iowa State bounced back in a nice way earlier this week against UCF, ending their two-game skid where they had a disastrous week a week ago in Big 12 play. UCF at Colorado at the top of the hour. Colorado's favorite in that one. They hung tough with Kansas a couple nights ago in Boulder. TCU goes to Baylor. And then the nightcap, Cincinnati at Arizona State in Big 12 play. This Big 12 conference, though, is an absolute gauntlet. There's two teams in the conference that are currently undefeated. That's Arizona at 6-0 and Houston 5-0. If Houston falls today to Texas Tech, that opens the door for BYU to climb up the standings. And in 2 weeks from today, BYU will host Houston. A lot of basketball left to be played until then, but Texas Tech could potentially have wins over Houston and BYU already on their resume in navigating the buzzsaw that is the Big 12. I think this conference this year, the depth isn't as good as what it's been in years past in the Big 12, but the top six in this league are outstanding. And the top in talent, I think there's four teams, maybe five, that could be Final Four good this year. I think Arizona, Houston, Texas Tech, and BYU are teams that could absolutely reach a Final Four. I think Iowa State could potentially too. My one knock on Iowa State is just I don't know if they've got the high-end NBA guys like the teams that I mentioned. Kansas is an absolute wild card because, Darren Peterson, when he's healthy and he's available, he's an absolute bucket. I mean, he's going to fill it up. But they also struggle mightily away from Allen Fieldhouse. They can beat anyone in the country in Lawrence. But when they get away from Fog Allen, it's kind of a coin flip for the Jayhawks. So I don't know if I look at them as a Final Four team, but the top end of this league is truly elite. The middle, it's kind of average, I'd say, but the top end of this conference makes it the best league in America because really you could see, maybe two or three teams, depending on how the NCAA tournament bracket shakes out. You could see a good number of teams maybe from this league in the Final Four, and BYU, I think, is one of those teams that looks like they have the profile, potentially, when you look at their defense and offensive metrics, to potentially be a Final Four team. But a long way to go, and they got to take care of business one game at a time, stack those days, as Kevin Young says. and that starts with BYU and Utah today, tip-off at 3:30. Let's take a break. On the other side, we'll get some BYU football talk as the 2026 schedule is out. Let's unpack it next here on Cougar Sports Saturday.
It's Cougar Sports Saturday.
That's caught! Touchdown! Stayed inside the boundary and gets in for 6.
Cougar Sports Saturday, a presentation of KSL Sports.
Ritchie right to the rim, driving score! He would not be denied!
BYU Sports Talk by Cougar fans for Cougar fans. Sponsored by Any Hour Services, electrical, plumbing, heating, and air. Your hosts are Mitch Harper and Kyle Ireland. On Utah's legacy home of the Cougars, KSL News Radio, 102.7 FM and 1160 AM.
Welcome back into Cougar Sports Saturday here on KSL News Radio. KSL News Time, 1:07 p.m. on this Saturday, January 24th. It's BYU basketball game day, yes, but it's not too far from BYU football having spring practices, and then before we know it, it's another season of BYU football here on the legacy home of the Cougars, KSL News Radio, and it all kicks off the 2026 season on September 5th when BYU hosts the Utah Tech Trailblazers. We knew that game was on the schedule, but we finally learned the rest of the schedule as to the dates of all the opponents that BYU would face this season as the 2026 BYU football schedule is officially out. Here's the schedule. September 5th, Utah Tech at home. September 12th, Arizona comes to Provo to kick off Big 12 play in Week 2. So the earliest BYU has kicked off Big 12 play since joining the league in 2023. September 19th, the Cougars go out to the Front Range and go to the Choice City, Fort Collins, to take on old WAC and Mountain West rival Colorado State, who is joining the Pac-12. Who would imagine telling someone 20 years ago, hey, when BYU and Colorado State play, it's going to be a Big 12 and Pac-12 game. That's what it'll be on September 19th in Fort Collins. September 26th, BYU has a bye. Their only bye of the season. So that means BYU will have 9 straight weeks with games. No byes. There's only one bye this season due to the season starting in September. On years where the last 2 years the seasons have started in August, that creates 2 bye weeks in a given season. October 3rd, BYU goes to TCU. October 10th, Iowa State comes to Provo, and then this one, massive game. October 17th, Notre Dame rolls into Provo for what could be maybe the game of the year for not only BYU, but maybe the biggest game among Big 12 teams this season, because Notre Dame is being viewed as a potential favorite to win the national title next season, and BYU's got high expectations as well. Massive game with BYU hosting Notre Dame on the schedule next season. October 24th at UCF. October 31st, Halloween, BYU and Arizona State. That just screams a perfect fit for Halloween, that game, which I believe is growing into a rivalry in the Big 12. There's already the old school history back in the WAC. But how that game played out 2 years ago in Tempe with the high emotions, the dramatic finish, the premature field storming, that's going to be a big game. And then November 7th at Utah. Again, the Big 12 does not put this game on the final weekend of the season. But at the same time, I think we just can continuously argue about that. And we go past year after year anymore, and it's like the last time BYU and Utah were annually playing at the final week of the season, that was 16 years ago. It's almost a lifetime ago. We're almost getting used to just this game always has random dates. In these 16 years, it's been August, it's been September. There was 1 year in 2018 where it was the final week of the season. But BYU and Utah never gets that final weekend. And honestly, that stretch between Independence and Pac-12 for Utah, where they took it away from the final week of the season, that's what destroyed the history of that game always being on the final week of the season. And even the Big 12 football officials have noted that they let Arizona State be on the final week of the season because annually it has always been there. Whereas when they inherited BYU and Utah, this was a rivalry that they looked at the dates and just said, this thing's played all over the map. It has no rhyme or reason to when it's played. It's always used to playing in random dates, so we'll throw it in random dates. It goes back to the same weekend that it was played 2 years ago at Rice-Eccles Stadium. That was a November 9th game. This one, of course, November 7th, BYU at Utah. And look, whenever that game is played, it's always big time. You could play it in April, and the game's big time. Like, that's just how BYU and Utah goes. It always lives up to the price of admission. It's a big-time game. November 14th, BYU comes back home and plays Baylor. November 21st at Kansas. Oh, man. Kansas in November? I'm having pooch punt flashbacks. November 28th, Cincinnati to close out the regular season. The Big 12 Football Championship also has a change. That will be played on a Friday night, December 4th in prime time, 6 p.m. Mountain Time on ABC in Arlington, Texas. Remember, this past December, last month, BYU played Texas Tech in a 10 a.m. spot on a Saturday. Personally, I like that Saturday morning window because I think it's a great spot where you get a lot of viewers. You get a lot of people who are wired to watch football on a Saturday. I think people just naturally, their routines would say that they're going to watch more football on a Saturday. Friday night's a good football night spot, but I would rather go with a Saturday game personally, but the Big 12 said that that will alternate every other year, that Friday and Saturday spot going forward with the Big 12 Football Championship. But that's the schedule for BYU in 2026. Some odds and ends that I find interesting. October 3rd at TCU. It'll be the first time in 21 years that BYU plays on General Conference weekend. Keep in mind, the Big 12 did say that they will still announce maybe some Friday games and some weeknight games at a later date. So there's a possibility that game still goes maybe to a Friday. That would make a lot of sense. BYU at TCU, that just screams a Friday night ESPN or Fox type game. But if that date stands, BYU will play at TCU on that Saturday of General Conference. Hasn't happened in 21 years. I remember 2005 San Diego State. I think President Gordon B. Hinckley in the priesthood session of General Conference kind of ended the session early so we could all go home and watch the BYU football game against San Diego State. So there's a little bit of history there. BYU did lose that game against San Diego State on that General Conference Saturday in 2005, but I thought that was just kind of interesting from a BYU perspective. The early game against Arizona, I think, is awesome in week 2 because Arizona's going to have a lot of preseason hype, I believe, on the heels of a 9-4 season for the Wildcats. Really good bounce back year in year 2 for Brent Brennan's squad. And if you're talking about how can you maximize the visibility of a BYU-Arizona matchup, that's the way to do it. Two teams that are going to have a lot of preseason hype. Get that thing on an early calendar spot and get it in the national focus early on the schedule. I like that window for BYU and Arizona. Some other things that I like on this schedule, 7 home games. You think back to this past season, and yes, a bowl game, you're always going to travel. The Big 12 Football Championship game, you're going to travel. But there were 14 games BYU played, 8 of which required a plane ride. BYU on this schedule has only 5 road games, and only 4 of which are going to require a plane. And what's nice, too, is that 2 of the road games are also in the Mountain Time Zone. So in a national league like the Big 12, where it spans close to coast, BYU's not going to travel that much. Their big travel games are at TCU on October 3rd, and then October 24th at UCF, which is a 2 time zone game, which is always, that can be a bear, and then November 21st at Kansas. You know, at Colorado State on September 19th, that's your first road game, but then you've got a bye, and then you go at TCU to gear up for that back-to-back or road games. So I like that standpoint where this team isn't going to be on the road much. It feels like they're going to be at home in Provo, and for a BYU team that brings back so much retention from a great 12-2 team in BYU that finished number 11 in the AP Top 25. I think there's a lot to like with this schedule, but it's a hard draw. I mean, that's the Big 12. I think every Big 12 team, their fan bases look at this and say, their respective schedules and say, I could see 10-2. I could see 12-0, because these Big 12 logos don't make you think that it's an impossible ask to beat those teams. And BYU doesn't have Texas Tech on the schedule. I look at this schedule and say BYU could have another big year. And with how much is returning, that's going to be the expectation for BYU. But it's a tough draw. You stack them up, and there's a game in this schedule that we're not thinking about right now that's going to become an absolute blockbuster-type game. You know, who was saying last year that BYU and Texas Tech was going to be the talk of the country? 2 years ago, who was saying BYU and Arizona State was going to be an absolute pure cinema-type game in Tempe? So that's the beauty of the Big 12, is that there's some game laying in the weeds that we're not thinking about that could be an absolute blue-chip type game that really elevates and crystallizes a playoff resume. So that's what I always like about the Big 12 Conference. Let's get more into this schedule and maybe expectations for BYU, as some way too early top 25 polls are out. Where does BYU rank for 2026? We'll hit on that next here on Cougar Sports Saturday. Cougar Sports Saturday rolls on here on KSL News Radio. Mitch Harper with you here. Way too early college football polls are out. Early forecast for the 2026 season in college football. With a BYU football team that has so much returning, L.J. Martin, the Big 12 Offensive Player of the Year, he's back. Evan Johnson, star cornerback, he's back. Isaiah Glasker, he's back. Keanu Tanavasa, he's back. Oh, by the way, heralded quarterback Bear Bachmeier, he's running it back. BYU has so much returning next season, and after a 12-2 year, knocking on the door of the college football playoff, and after not only this past season, but back-to-back years with different personnel in both seasons, BYU is winning at a high level, 23 wins over the past 2 years. You would think that BYU would be a slam dunk to be maybe a way too early top 10 for next year. Some media outlets have that, but others do not. Here's some way too early outlooks for BYU in 2026. ESPN, in their way too early rankings, has BYU at number 11. CBS Sports, number 12 for BYU. Fox has the Cougars at number 10. That's R.J. Young. Joel Klatt doesn't have BYU in the top 10. He noted that BYU's got what he calls a ceiling on their potential. I'm thinking, has toe met leather yet for the 2026 season, and they've already got a supposed ceiling? Okay. Sports Illustrated's got BYU at number 9 for 2026, and then Pro Football Focus has got the Cougars at number 10, along with the Athletic, the highest-ranked BYU team, or ranking for 2026, way too early. Number 8 is the Athletic. They got BYU at 8 there. Athlon Sports has the Cougars at number 14. I think BYU, if they start in the AP Top 25 poll, and again, remember, it doesn't have any necessarily bearing on the college football playoff, but the behaviors of the playoff committee have shown us that it clearly does, that preseason poll. So your starting position will be very important. And BYU potentially starting at 12, 13, wherever it may be, great. That's awesome. I think that's really good for BYU, and then they just got to keep stacking up those wins. It does feel like there's a more strict baseline for a team like BYU to just move up the rankings than, say, an SEC or a Big Ten team. But BYU getting a little bit of love in the way too early polls, and it's deserved because, again, they've shown that they can win. Because when you look over the last 2 years, BYU is winning at a high clip with a bunch of different guys. Yes, there is some crossover, like an Isaiah Glasker. Jack Kelly, of course, was part of it the past 2 years. Chase Roberts was a common thread. L.J. Martin. But then the quarterbacks, two different guys. Some of the role players, offensive linemen, defensive linemen, different personnel, different cornerbacks. So there was a lot of key moving pieces over the last 2 years, yet they consistently won. And in this decade, you think about what BYU's accomplished since 2020, 11 wins in 2020. 2021, they won 11, or they won 10, in 2021. In 2022, they won 8. 23 was a dip year, 5 and 7. But then 2024, 2025, 11 and 12. You're talking about 4 years since 2020 where BYU is winning 10 plus. They are winning at a high clip. That's what they do. And with so much returning from last year's team, that should be the expectation, because I think what Kalani Sitake's program has done a really nice job in recent years is that the games that they're expected to win, they do. And what's crazy is that they're not expected to win many games ever by these forecasters and prognosticators. They always seem, the last 2 years, to be an underdog. They always defy the odds. But when the games that they are projected to win, they do take care of business. The only times that they're losing games was Texas Tech this past year. That one game, Kansas, that was the head scratcher 2 years ago. The other one was Arizona State, who was a playoff team. 3 of BYU's last 4 losses were to playoff teams. So again, BYU is competing with the best of the best in college football. They're taking care of the games that they should win, even when they're more times than not being projected to lose half those games. BYU is going to be, I would expect, a highly rated team next year. They got to have all their personnel that we're expecting right now to stay intact, because we've seen that any sort of loss, and last year it was quarterback, which makes a lot of sense. I get it. There was a lot of questions at that position, but that one player changed the whole entire preseason outlook when BYU lost Retzloff. That changed their whole entire preseason outlook. If they had kept Retzloff, do they reach the playoff this past season? I think they do, because they would have had the preseason starting position. So it's such an important deal, and it might sound ridiculous to even be talking about way too early polls in January, but the perception matters in college football. We've learned that time and time again, even after a national title being won by Indiana. Sometimes the national media still can't help themselves and catapult Texas into the top 2 of the way too early rankings. They fall in love with these brands, the star rankings, but what BYU has going for them, they've got a great culture, they've got a great locker room, and they've got some really good talent that are running it back, paired up with some impactful transfers. BYU should be a highly ranked team in the preseason poll next year. Let's take a break. Let's talk more BYU football. What should be the goals for 2026 next here on Cougar Sports Saturday?
It's Cougar Sports Saturday.
That's caught! Touchdown! Stayed inside the boundary and gets in for 6.
Cougar Sports Saturday, a presentation of KSL Sports.
Richie right to the rim, driving score! He would not be denied!
BYU Sports Talk by Cougar fans for Cougar fans. Sponsored by Any Hour Services, electrical, plumbing, heating, and air. Your hosts are Mitch Harper and Kyle Ireland. On Utah's legacy home of the Cougars, KSL News Radio, 102.7 FM and 1160 AM.
Welcome back into Cougar Sports Saturday here on KSL News Radio. Mitch Harper with you. Getting you ready for BYU and Utah in men's hoops today. 3:30 p.m. tip-off between the Cougs and the Utes. BYU has won 7 of their last 10 meetings against Utah, including a 5-point victory, 89-84 2 weeks ago at the Huntsman Center. They conclude the season series today at the Marriott Center. BYU is looking to extend Utah's road losing streak, currently at 12 games, to a 13th game. Utah hasn't won a road game since last year in January when they took down TCU on the road in Cowtown. So BYU, big favorite today against the Utes in basketball. We'll get more breakdown and analysis and preview of that BYU-Utah game coming up a little bit later as we get you ready for tip-off at 3:30 p.m. later today. But BYU football is navigating the offseason with a lot of momentum after a 12-2 season a year ago, and it has people dreaming possibly of the program's first college football playoff appearance next year. I think that's a reasonable goal for a team that's won 23 games the past 2 years and honestly has had a playoff-type resume the past 2 seasons. Still, they haven't reached the playoff. And the format that they will look to break through into next year, well, it'll be a 12-team playoff once again. The College Football Playoff Management Committee announced yesterday that the playoff format will remain at 12 teams. Personally, I'm not a big fan of that. I think it should have gone to 24 teams because ultimately I think that would have benefited the Big 12. The Big 10 has expressed that they want 24 teams. The SEC wants 16 teams. The Big 12 commissioner, Brett Yormark, has said that they want a 16-team format, 5 automatic bids plus 11 at large. But to me, I think the perfect format for the Big 12 would have been 24 teams with 4 automatic qualifiers from each of the Power 4 leagues and have 2 automatic qualifiers from the group of 6 and then the rest be at large. That way you can truly settle it on the field and quit the perception of this conference is better. It then all plays out on the field. It's just like the NCAA tournament in basketball every year. You get all these teams from these conferences in there, and you can almost say, that was the best league that given season. Last year it was the SEC in hoops. You could confidently say that was the best league in basketball. Football, it feels like there's still a little bit of a gray area at times as to who was truly the best conference in the sport year after year. Still, with that said, the college football playoff is going to be at 12 teams. And BYU has to try to find a way to crack through that. The first 2 years of the 12-team playoff format, the Big 12 has only produced 1 bid. It's been the Big 12 champion the past 2 years, and that's what BYU's challenge is in front of them next season, is to try to crack into the 12-team playoff and get that bid. Hopefully for the Big 12 they could get multiple bids into the field, but it just seems like the odds are against them. It probably would have to be Texas Tech and BYU because both of those teams are going to have a lot of preseason momentum behind them. Texas Tech, though, when you look at their schedule, they've got a cakewalk, potentially a cakewalk on their schedule. All their games that you would think are going to be the toughest games on the Big 12 schedule, they are in Lubbock. They have no one of note, really, that should give them any threat in non-conference play. Texas Tech should be a 12-0 team going to Arlington next year. And if they lose a game, they might be a team that is on the outside of the playoff picture. So, again, the margins are always thin for Big 12 teams in terms of trying to reach that playoff. But when you look at BYU football in 2026 and ask yourself, what should be the goal for BYU football next year, it's got to be the playoff. And I think that then ties into you got to be the Big 12 champion. When you bring as much back as BYU does, and all the run-it-back graphics that we saw early in the month, Falatau Satualas, Evan Johnsons, Keanu Tanavasas, Andrew Gentry's. All these guys. You just go through the depth chart, the potential depth chart. BYU has so much returning experience. And then you bring in Walker Lyons from USC. You bring in some really talented players, Cade Uluave from Cal. This is a really talented football team. And I think they're one that has a chance to really break through. And I think that data point of the Notre Dame game, if Notre Dame lives up to the hype that they're going to be receiving, that should be the X factor compared to the previous 2 years of BYU resumes. BYU had 2 years ago the SMU game where SMU went on to play in the playoff. They reached the ACC championship game. They had that 13th data point. And SMU was an excellent football team that year, and so was BYU. But in the moment, people looked at that game and said that's like a 2 6-6 football team squaring off on a Friday night in Dallas. No one really paid attention to that win. It was probably the most underappreciated win in all of college football in 2024. But the Notre Dame game instantly carries clout. It's going to be one of the biggest non-conference games in college football next year, you would think. And so that's kind of the difference here, where you think that game, if BYU could get one and maybe go 11-1 in the regular season and then potentially win the Big 12, I mean, that automatically punches your ticket into the playoff. But that game, to me, is what creates maybe a little more wiggle room to get an at-large bid, that Notre Dame game. But still, the margins are thin for Big 12 teams, and they've got to be darn near perfect to get into that 12-team field. But that should be the goal. And I don't think BYU should duck from that, because I know Cougar fans in the past have looked at seasons when there's high expectations, and BYU doesn't typically live up to those, I guess you could say, when history is said. Like 2022, BYU was a preseason top 25 team, and the defense totally bottomed out. And that was a really great offense with Jaron Hall at quarterback, and it was a missed opportunity year with an excellent NFL quarterback as a senior. They probably should have been a 10 or 11 win football team, but that defense was so bad, BYU didn't live up to it. So I think sometimes that there's this thought that BYU isn't the team that can live up to expectations when they're high. They're always the pesky underdog that surprises everyone. But this is a new era, and I kind of look at this season a little bit as almost like a new year one because of Kalani's new extension. To me, it's a new job for Kalani Sitake, where he steps into a new world where he is the head coach. There's no question about it. There wasn't debate as to whether Kalani was going to get fired or not. He had an extension the year prior with the years and whatnot. But again, it's just, I don't think Kalani's going to be flirting around with jobs. He wants to be at BYU, and he got a deal that's better than any coach has ever gotten at BYU football. And he's been the one man that's been able to break through and get the resources that BYU football has always needed to be at and to really compete at the highest of levels. And I'm sure there's still always areas where BYU could do more with its football program. But to me, this is kind of a year one of what BYU can look like with this new enhanced investment. And the early returns would suggest it's going quite well because, you know, players like an Isaiah Glasker, players like an Evan Johnson, it goes beyond, you know, the Michigans of the world. Like, those guys hit the portal, if they ever did, or they go to the NFL or whatever it is, they would have had so much interest from Power 4 programs, and they would have commanded a lot of dollars out of the portal. But you retain them, and they don't even kick the tires on the portal. Same with Falatau Satuala, who was a second-team All-American. And when you bring all those guys back, I think it highlights the culture that Kalani always talks about in his program. Guys are really bought into that. It's not just fluff service. It's not just coach speak. They kind of put up and really showed out that they believe in that culture by them not exiting and going to the portal, because whenever there's some sort of coaching change, as there was on the defensive side, that's always an easy route to justify moving on to a new spot. But all these guys pretty much ran it back. Yes, Max Alford, he went into the portal, went to Michigan. He's got family connections there, but I think Jay Hill also liked him as well. He was a good backup linebacker for BYU. But ultimately, the core was retained. And, you know, you would have loved to have had Jack Kelly back, but his eligibility is exhausted, and he's going to go off to the NFL. But this is a really good football team. And I think they're still hungry, too, because even though they've won a lot, and, yes, they're going to have a high ranking, I still get the sense that they can play the chip on the shoulder bit, because no one nationally is giving BYU their flowers. They're kind of going to rank them high because, well, honestly, you're just negligent if you're not giving BYU the respect that they deserve after winning 23 games over the last 2 years. But no one's going to take them serious to be maybe a playoff threat. So you can still play the chip on the shoulder piece if you're BYU and you're Kalani Sitake. You know, it's they don't know, but they about to find out. You can still play that, because I think there's still this national thought that, yeah, they beat a bunch of teams that were unranked, but when they faced the playoff team, they got wrecked twice. And that happened. Texas Tech hammered BYU. They don't acknowledge that, you win a Potter's Bowl against a ranked team. You had some good wins against Utah. I mean, really sound victories. That 31-point victory over TCU. TCU finished number 25 in the final AP Top 25 poll. No one nationally talks about that win. That was a 31-point beatdown at home over a nationally ranked team at season's end, yet no one ever brings that up. Because, again, they just kind of put BYU in the ceiling. So they can still play a little bit of the chip on the shoulder bit that BYU tends to thrive on. I think that's kind of a good space for BYU football to be in. But, again, the goals should be high. And no one should duck that. I don't think the coaching staff, I don't think the players are ducking that. You come back, as many of these guys did, you're chasing the playoff. You're chasing something big. And when you see an Indiana break through and become an outside-the-box brand, winning a title, why not BYU? Why not make a run at that thing and go do it? Because college football, the talent is spreading out more than ever before. And those culture programs that really have a strong locker room seem to be stronger than ever when it comes to that. So I think it's exciting times for BYU. Let's take a break. We'll get to a bracketology update as we get you ready for BYU and Utah and on the hardwood coming up a little bit later today right here on Cougar Sports Saturday. Welcome back into Cougar Sports Saturday here on KSL News Radio, 1:51 p.m. here in Provo as we get you ready for the Cougs and the Utes. Some good action in the Big 12 today. Close one out in West Texas in Lubbock. Number 12, Texas Tech, 71. Number 6, Houston, 71. Texas Tech actually just knocked down a free throw. It's 72-71, 8:22 to go in the second half in that one. That's going to be a big game to potentially decide, the Big 12 championship outlook. The second meeting between those two teams right now. Houston got the first win over Texas Tech, and Texas Tech's looking to counter and get a victory over the Cougs, who are the two-time reigning Big 12 regular season champions this season. Out in Tucson, BYU's next opponent on Monday night, the number 1 ranked Arizona Wildcats, well, they're going to stay undefeated and number 1. They are up 78-48 on West Virginia, 3:46 to go in the McKell Center. The Wildcats look dominant. So you're going to see on Monday night a 20-0 Arizona team come to Provo. How awesome is that? I mean, you think about the stages that Cougar fans were excited about by joining the Big 12. This league, the top end of the conference, is outstanding. BYU and Arizona, man, you got to take care of business today. But thinking about that game on Monday night, that is going to be such a good game. I cannot wait for that one. I would have to think, too, that's probably on the secondary market going to be one of the most expensive BYU basketball home game tickets maybe ever. That's going to be a good one. Also around the Big 12, number 9 Iowa State is up 51-21 in Stillwater on Oklahoma State. Man, that's surprising. Oklahoma State's not a great defensive team, but they can keep up with teams offensively. And Iowa State in Stillwater, only letting the Pokes score 21 on their home floor. They're up by 30 at the break. And then in Boulder, UCF is up 49-47 on Colorado at the half. And UCF is one of those teams that's currently a little bit of a bubble team, kind of in that 8-9 territory in bracketology forecast. Meanwhile, BYU viewed as kind of a consensus, not a consensus, but an average 3 seed in bracketology forecast. ESPN Joe Lunardi has BYU as a 3 seed in Portland. If the NCAA tournament started today, going up against 14 seed North Dakota State. Some other forecasts in bracketology have BYU a 4 seed. One of the brackets that I tend to kind of keep track of in terms of bracketology is hoopshd.com, and I love this bracket forecast. They've got BYU as a 3 seed in Portland, and then on the other side, the potential round of 32 matchup, 6 seed Kentucky versus 11 seed Iowa. Mark Pope versus Kevin Young, maybe in the round of 32. Sign me up for that. Hey, Kentucky, on a 5-game win streak, they took down Ole Miss today, I believe, in Rupp Arena in their early morning tip in SEC play. So Kentucky kind of turning things around after what was a slow start to their SEC season, but that would be quite the game for Kentucky there. But this big game for BYU, again, Utah today, 3:30 tip for the Cougs and the Utes here at the Marriott Center. In the bracketology, BYU, this isn't a game where BYU is going to climb up bracketology forecast by getting a win over Utah. Utah's a 9-10 team overall, but the games in front of BYU after this one, they could really start to climb the seed lines potentially in bracketology forecast. Maybe they could get into that 2-seed territory, because we saw last year it was the chalkiest of chalk NCAA tournament runs where all 4 1 seeds reached the Final Four. Now, you can't assume that every single year, because I think this season in college basketball is one of the best years maybe in the last 15 years in terms of actual depth of teams that could win a national title. Like, I think you got 10 or 12 teams that could be good enough to cut down the nets and win it all this season. So even a 2 or 3 seed could get to the Final Four and win the whole dang thing. And I think BYU's in that territory, but definitely doesn't hurt the cause to, get into that 2-seed territory, because I'd rather face a 7 or a 10 seed in the second round compared to a 6 seed in the round of 32. So every game is a great data point in the Big 12 Conference, and BYU is going to have a lot of quad 1 opportunities in front of them coming up here. And it starts today with Utah is a quad 3 game, 3:30 tip, but then they got 5 straight quad 1 games with Arizona on Monday, then Kansas next Saturday. It's a tough stretch of play coming up ahead for BYU basketball. Let's take a break. On the other side, I'll get to the availability report. So we're about an hour and a half away until tip-off between the Cougs and the Utes, and then we'll also get a breakdown on this matchup coming up next here on Cougar Sports Saturday, and it's powered by KSL Sports.
It's Cougar Sports Saturday.
That's caught! Touchdown! Stayed inside the boundary and gets in for 6.
Cougar Sports Saturday, a presentation of KSL Sports.
Richie right to the rim, driving score! He would not be denied!
BYU Sports Talk by Cougar fans for Cougar fans. Sponsored by Any Hour Services, electrical, plumbing, heating, and air. Your hosts are Mitch Harper and Kyle Ireland. On Utah's legacy home of the Cougars, KSL News Radio, 102.7 FM and 1160 AM.
Welcome back into Cougar Sports Saturday here on KSL News Radio as we get you ready for BYU and Utah here on KSL News Radio. News time, 2:06 p.m. BYU and the Utes. Availability report just came out. No surprises there, and I think that's a good news for BYU because in the last game against Texas Tech, their setback in Lubbock, Hadim Boop exited that game, but he's not on the availability report. He's good to go, that according to Kevin Young, for this game. And that's important because Hadim Boop is one of those guys that can guard really anyone on the floor in a game. You know, he can go kind of 1 through 5 in terms of guarding anyone on the floor, and that's important for BYU because Utah's got a guard in Terrence Brown who is a high-volume guy. He's one of the most utilized players in really the Big 12 and all of college basketball. Utah relies heavily on Terrence Brown. I think the recipe for BYU is kind of simple in a way against Utah. You've got to just, contain Terrence Brown and Don McHenry. Both of those guys are good enough to really score 45, 50 points on any given night. If you can somehow contain them, that's going to bode well for BYU. Look, the Cougars are a huge favorite in this game today against Utah. You're looking at maybe, a 20-point margin in terms of BYU being favored by prognosticators heading into this game. But still, rivalry games can always be a little bit tricky in these spots. And if you get someone like a Terrence Brown who can get hot, that can kind of change the dynamic and maybe the outlook and the feel of a game if he gets rolling because, against Kansas State, he had 31 points in their setback in Manhattan earlier this week. So he's more than enough capable of putting up big numbers. So BYU's got to take care of him. And I think it helps that, someone like a Hadim Boop is not on the availability report after taking what looked to be a really hard fall in Lubbock against Texas Tech. He's good to go for this game. The players that are out for BYU are the ones that we've kind of known are out. Brody Kozlowski, Nate Pickens, Dawson Baker, Xavier Staten. Those are the guys that are out for BYU, and no real surprises either for Utah on their end. So pretty clean bill of health for both teams heading into this rivalry matchup, which tips off today, coming up in about an hour and 21 minutes for BYU and Utah here at 3:30 p.m. on KSL News Radio. We'll have coverage of that with BYU and Utah here at the Marriott Center for that game as the students start to file into the Rock, and they're getting settled in here at the Marriott Center for an afternoon matinee game here at the Marriott Center for BYU and Utah. I always enjoy these Saturday afternoon conference basketball games in January. Compared to the last home game, that was a 9 p.m. tip for the TCU game. This is a pleasant welcome, having an afternoon game. Now, keep in mind, BYU women are actually going to have a game tonight also at the Marriott Center against a ranked team, number 22, West Virginia. They'll play them and a little bit of a doubleheader of sorts here at the Marriott Center. That's a 7:30 p.m. tip for that one. So be a jam-packed day of BYU basketball. And I think some of the keys for BYU in this game, you got to get A.J. DiBonsa rolling, get him to his spots, the mid-range, or as the middies, as A.J. likes to call him, get him to his spots and get him on a roll. Against Texas Tech, he scored a season-low 13 points. But I think more notably in that game, he only had one free throw attempt. And you can't control the refs. But, AJ and these Big 12 refs will sometimes let a little bit too much sometimes go in terms of the physicality. Texas Tech did a really good job of preventing sending AJ to the foul line. BYU's got to make sure to get him rolling in this game, get him to his spots where he feels most comfortable in the mid-range, and I think that'll allow him to get to the free throw line and be the AJ that we've kind of grown accustomed to this season, where he's always in that territory of 21, 23 points. And then if he's filling it up at the foul line, maybe knocking down a few threes, he suddenly can get into that 30-point territory. That's just what A.J. DiBonsa does. I expect a really good game from him because I'm sure he was not happy with having that 13-point performance and the loss in Lubbock. So I expect a bounce-back showing from A.J. today. Another thing I want to see from BYU in this game is on the glass, rebounding. Utah's got James Okonkwo, who's really a good offensive rebounder, and Keanu Dawes is good on the defensive glass. BYU's just got to limit the opportunities for Utah when they're on the offensive end, the Utes. If BYU can limit Utah to just one shot, that's going to bode well for the Cougars. And then you can kind of get up and down the floor and get this thing in a position where BYU can potentially pull away, because there was so much talk 2 weeks ago at the Huntsman Center that BYU is going to roll in, dominate Utah. That didn't happen at all. Before BYU could really blink, they were down 7-0, and Utah was pretty successful on the offensive glass at times in that game. BYU's got to clean things up, make sure to dominate on the glass, and that's someone like a Keba Keita, who was very energized by that game a couple of weeks ago at the Huntsman Center. He played with a lot of emotion in that game. This will be an important spot for Keita. I mean, obviously, he's in his senior year, going up against his former team. And, what I like, too, about Keba Keita, and it's kind of an underrated aspect of this BYU team, we haven't seen Keita healthy much throughout this season. There's been various things where Keita has been dealing with an ankle, or he got banged up at UConn, an illness. He's kind of stacking up games now where multiple games he's playing healthy, that high energy that we expect from Keba Keita. I think that's a good thing for BYU going forward, but he's going to be key for BYU on the glass in this game. And then, of course, I want to see BYU shoot the three ball at a high clip. The last three games, it's been around 22, 23% in that territory. You go back to that Arizona State game earlier in Big 12 play, BYU shot around 45% from three. That we know this team is capable of knocking down the three-point shot. Let's see them hit it at a high clip in this one, because that way that'll allow them to really pull away and get comfortable in this game, because in a perfect world, with 20-0 Arizona looming on Monday night, You want to get this game done as early as possible. Get these guys rested. Get them ready to go for the quick turnaround coming up on Monday against the Arizona Wildcats, which will be the toughest test maybe of the season potentially coming up on Monday against the number 1 ranked Wildcats. But it all starts tonight with Utah, 3:30 tip here as fans roll into the Marriott Center for this big game, rivalry game. BYU's won 7 of the last 10 against the Utes. So BYU's been really good in these rivalry games. And really since, like you go back to 2006 when the changing of the guard with Dave Rose, it's been a pro BYU in the basketball side of this rivalry. There were stretches in the DeLon Wright, Jakob Poeltl years for Utah where it was leaning heavily in the Utes' favor. And even Utah at the Huntsman Center still gets the upper hand on BYU more times than not. But, BYU has, been primarily the better team in this basketball rivalry over the last 20 or so years. And you always want to take care of business against your in-state rival, even though neither of these teams have strong local in-state influences. Richie Saunders, of course, for BYU, maybe Keanu Dawes for Utah, even though he's a Houston guy. Derek Dawes is his uncle, a former BYU center. There's not as many strong local ties in this iteration of the BYU-Utah rivalry as we see so much in football, where there's so much crossover between the two programs. Still, this game means a lot to the BYU athletic department, the school, the fan base. You got to take care of this one, and don't take it lightly because these rivalry games mean a whole lot to so many people, and it'd be a big win for BYU to just get back on the winning side of things, because last week against Texas Tech, it was a setback. It was only the second time this season that BYU's experienced a loss. You want to get back on the winning side of things in this one. Let's take a break. Final break of the show, and then we'll get you ready for BYU and Utah here on KSL News Radio. Welcome back into Cougar Sports Saturday on this BYU basketball game day as the Cougars get ready to take on the Utah Utes. Say less. Tip-off at 3:30 p.m. right here on KSL. We'll have full coverage on KSLSports.com for the Cougs and the Utes. It's going to be a huge game. And you're seeing a lot of national media here as well, too. CBS Sports, they're here for this game. I would assume also maybe for the Monday game between BYU and Arizona. Arizona, of course, took down West Virginia today, so Arizona improves to 20-0, and coming up on Monday, they'll be rolling into Provo for what should be a massive game between BYU and the Wildcats. But BYU's got to first take care of the rival Utes, and Alex Jensen and his squad rolled into the Marriott Center about an hour and a half before tip-off. They were here about 20 minutes ago. They rolled in right by the ticket office area, got into the building. So they've arrived here at the facility at the Marriott Center for this rivalry game, which BYU has got the upper hand 2 weeks ago, 89-84 in Alex Jensen's first game as Utah's head coach in this rivalry. And, Kevin Young and Alex Jensen should be quite the battle, I think, in the years to come, not only this year, but in the years ahead. Kevin Young, when I asked him about Yegor Dielman at the midway point of the NBA, Kevin Young talked about how he loves being at BYU because it still allows him the chance to connect with all of his NBA connections. And guys like Yegor give him that chance. And that's going to be something that continues in the future with A.J. DeBonsa, Richie Saunders, Rob Wright, guys that are future NBA players. But Alex Jensen, I don't know if it's necessarily the same model with the, former NBA background, but Utah's doing a little bit different operation than BYU, but still two well-respected guys in the NBA and in basketball battling it out in this rivalry game. It should be some fun rivalry battles in the years ahead between Kevin Young and Alex Jensen. And with the Big 12 being the center stage to it all, it makes for a big opportunity and big platform for this BYU-Utah basketball rivalry, not only today, but in the years ahead. And look, Utah comes into this game, they're struggling. They're 9-10. They've only won one Big 12 game. They're kind of on different platforms right now as programs, but still, and it can happen in these rivalry games. We saw that 2 weeks ago where Utah was right there with BYU. That was a full 40-minute game. I don't know if they're as equipped to do that here at the Marriott Center with this crowd behind BYU still. Maybe crazier things could happen, and that could be something that could really turn around Utah if they were able to pull off some upset here in Provo. Utah has lost their last 12 road games, 10 Big 12 road games. The Utes have struggled in road games this season. But right now, I want to give you my score prediction for this game. I think BYU wins. I think they win by double figures. I'm going to go with BYU 88, Utah 73 to get this game done. And I think BYU improves to 17-2 overall and sets up a massive stage against Arizona. I'm going to say BYU's big three combines for 70 points in this game. I'm saying BYU gets to 88. I think the big three accounts for 70. And however you want to slice that up between A.J. DeBonsa, Richie Saunders, and Rob Wright, you can do that however you wish, but I think they're going to get up to that 70-point threshold. I expect some big games from those guys. And, for Richie Saunders, this is a last guaranteed opportunity to play Utah as a BYU Cougar, a former Riverton native, grew up here locally watching the BYU-Utah rivalry. This game means a lot to him. I mean, it meant a lot 2 weeks ago for him to get his first win in the Huntsman Center. He definitely doesn't want to go out in his last game against the Utes with a loss. So I think Richie has a big game. I think BYU's big three. You can always count on them to have big games. It's just how big will the games be? I think it'll be really impactful, and I think they get 70 points today between those three. I also look for, Kaba Keita to have an impactful night as well. Maybe a double-double type territory potentially for Kaba. Maybe one of those classic 8 and 12 rebound type games for Kaba Keita today. For Utah, it's Terrence Brown and Dom McHenry. I'll be curious to see how much they can kind of combine for and how BYU can slow them down and kind of keep them in check, because if they do, BYU could really pull away from the Utes. But I think they're going to still, to some extent, get theirs. So I expect, again, BYU 88, Utah 73. That's my final score prediction for this game here at the Marriott Center. But it's going to be a good game, here back at the Marriott Center for another home clash in Provo for Big 12 play, and really sets the table for what's going to be a massive run of 5 quad 1 games after this one. Today's a quad 3. Then they've got 5 quad 1 opportunities in front of them for this Cougar squad to really start to bolster its potential resume as one of the better teams in college basketball this season. But they've got the potential. They've got the ability. And great BYU teams always take care of business against rival Utah. So that's what's in front of them today. We'll have full coverage of BYU and Utah here on KSL News Radio. Greg Wrubell, Mark Durant, Jason Shepard will have coverage with the call on the broadcast. Then on KSLSports.com, going to have written content, going to have a post-game podcast on the Cougar Tracks podcast feed, which, of course, Cougar Tracks is available every single day at 6:30 p.m. right here on KSL News Radio. But that's going to do it from here in Provo for Cougar Sports Saturday. We'll toss it over to Greg Wrubell and the crew to call BYU versus Utah right here on the legacy home of the Cougars, KSL News Radio.